Hey, sorry about the interruption. Yeah, we have to have two videos because my phone died and this is on my phone. But I was just about to just briefly touch on the three major African empires and what they have to do with Islamic trade and expansion. That's something you should know. That's also in your map book. The three major African empires in West Africa, not Kemet. We're moving to a different region, West Africa. So we're getting closer and closer to that which is relevant to the American story. That's Ghana, Mali, and Songhai. And Ghana literally means gold in Arabic, and this was like the first empire. And then Mali comes along later. And these are also all three a part of the Arab African exchange. So Mali comes along and it's takes over the turf of what was once the Ghana Empire, and it expands that. More people in the Mali Empire are converted to Islam, and Songhai is the third iteration or the third version of that, where it expands even larger in kind of a different direction on the continent, but it's also a large territory. And it is, by that time, the Songhai Empire, it is primarily Islamic, and this part of Africa is what we now would call Senegal, Guinea, Mali, that region. And notable parts that you should know that they may not go into detail about is in the Empire of Mali. This is the second version. The people call themselves Manding people, Mandingos, or Malinkes. They participate in this gold salt trade with the Arab world, where the Africans in the Mali Empire, give the Arabs gold, and the Arabs give them salt, because salt is a very important commodity at this time in the world, because it can preserve meat and do all other kinds of stuff. In Mali, they also had a capital city called Timbuktu. Most of us just refer to Timbuktu as like that far away place. But this is a major university. It's actually the first modern university in the world, not like from the ancient world, not like from Kemet, but the first modern university. In fact, these Islamic Africans in Timbuktu, they actually go to Spain and build a corresponding, like a sister school in Spain called Saint-Coré. And that is essentially Europe's first modern university. It is built by Islamic Africans from the Mali Empire. Two notable leaders in the Mali Empire. The first one is King Mansa Musa, or Emperor Mansa Musa. You should know him. He's the king of bling. When he did his pilgrimage to Mecca, as a good converted Muslim would, he actually has enough gold that, as his caravan, his entourage of horses and camels and everything, as they stop at each place for rest along the way, as they cross the Sahara, he leaves enough gold in each location to build its own mosque. Like, he's just making it rain across all of Africa. He's so famous for how much wealth he has. The Europeans even write about him and draw pictures of him at this time. The second leader you should know about is Sundiata Keita, also known as the Lion King. So Disney, they owe those folks some reparations or something, or some compensation for using essentially their story about their king who unites the 12 districts of the empire and brings them all together. And yeah, I guess it's animals now, but it's real. It's real. It really happened. And so that's that story. And Songhai is the third version of this. King Sunny Ali takes Timbuktu and establishes it as the capital of a new empire. This is Songhai. But all of these three major African empires, as wonderful and elaborate as they were a part of a slave trade. So before the Europeans came along, there was an Arab slave trade, an Arab trade in enslaved Africans, more aptly. And slavery in the Arab world looked a little different. So Africans are being transported across the Sahara. We don't want to call it the Sahara Desert. Don't do that. Sahara means desert, so you're saying the desert when you say that. So But Africans are taken across the desert into the Islamic or the Arab world in the Middle East to work and in unfree conditions. The difference between Arab slavery and European slavery is Arab slavery is more like everybody else's system of servitude. The people who are enslaved are still considered human beings. They still have human rights. For the most part, these rights are outlined in the law, even in the Quran, which is like the spiritual law of the Arab world at this time. The Quran actually lists and kind of describes what the rights of an enslaved person are. So they have to follow the Quranic law, and so this is in some ways protection for enslaved Africans. Many Africans in the Arab world intermarry into these families, and they can rise up in the ranks, join the military, buy property, etc. And primarily the enslaved Africans that ended up in the Middle East were women. They wanted women. This is where we get the concept of a harem from, or a harem. Buying African women and having a bunch of African women living in your house as concubines was a sign of wealth. It's like having a garage full of luxury cars, and they would dress them up in fine silks and things like that. And this was the status of African people in their relationship with the Arab world. However, it wasn't as widespread. What happens is Europeans come along and intercept the Arab trade routes and take over the trade in enslaved people from Africa. They intensify and take larger numbers, and instead of kind of building a relationship, they actually just destroy the African societies that they take people from. And we'll talk more about that in subsequent units. But the other thing that's different about the European trade is that the Europeans are the first group on the planet to make slavery racial only. It is a race-based system. The Arab world does not just have Africans as enslaved people, but the Europeans do, and it is a chattel system, which means that enslaved people have lost their human rights. In fact, they have lost their status as human beings altogether. They are not considered people anymore under that system, which means they cannot own property, they cannot testify in court, they cannot read, they are not allowed to do things that human beings do. They don't have protections as human beings under any law. In fact, human beings can make the laws and govern what happens to each individual in each individual situation, which is very dangerous for an enslaved person. So we'll find out more about that later. Okay, moving on to commentary. I wanted to talk about this article that you all hopefully have read. And this, again, is an excerpt from a book called The Nile Valley Contributions to Civilization by a guy named Anthony Browder. You can actually meet him. He's in D.C. He runs the Institute for Kemetic Guidance, and you can actually go. They give tours, a really cool tour called Egypt on the Potomac, and they go around. You go on a bus and they show you all of the ancient Egyptian architecture and symbols and spiritual symbols and power symbols that are all over Washington, D.C. His argument is, and it's quite compelling and he has got lots of evidence, is the founding fathers of this country, of the United States, actually took some of the power symbols of ancient Egypt and used them and built them into the city here in order to establish America as the new global empire. But it's interesting. I mean, I would just check him out. But the book is good because it really gives not just an overview of Nile Valley civilizations. It really starts with this very interesting introduction where he kind of lays out a lot of concepts about Africa that people need to, I think, are very useful for our class. I'll say that. So he starts with this question of like, what's in a name? When you read that, you'll see that. Like, he kind of analyzes the naming traditions of people of African descent in America. He starts, by talking about Negro. First, we are considered Negroes. We'll talk about the origin of that word. It does not just mean black in Spanish. Negro is not just that. It's deeper than that. And so we'll talk about that. But colored. That's another, that's the term that black people or people of African descent are referred to, especially beginning in the early 20th century in the 1900s. Black, after the civil rights movement, more of us adopt the term black to refer to ourselves as a political term. And in 1988, we become African Americans. And he talks about the 3 different responses that African Americans have, or black people have, to this new term. Like, do we like African American? Do we like that term? Some do, some don't. Some are ambivalent. And then on page 26, he's got that rhyme that is a kind of a put down rhyme that speaks to the racist kind of ranking, the hierarchy of race, where it's like white is right and black step back and all that other stuff. He mentions briefly stereotypes. Again, we go back to Africa as a land that is mythologized and talked about, and how most people, what they learn about Africa is stereotypical. So I've posted a video for you to watch called Jungle Jitters. I hope you get a chance to look at it. It's got all the stereotypes in it. African is another term. Like, even though we were Yoruba, Hausa, Igbo, Becheve, Congo, most African people eventually started to kind of come together and kind of refer to themselves collectively as Africans. And so throughout slavery, even though we were referred to by white people as Negroes, many of us still just refer to ourselves as Africans, and that was popular all the way up through the 18th and early 19th century. Most black people today prefer to be called what? I don't know. It's something to think about. He says black. Most people here prefer to be called black as opposed to African American. I don't know. Maybe that's changed since he published this book. But John Henrik Clarke tells us, moving on, that history is a clock. History tells people their political and cultural time of day. And that's why it's so important for us to study it. He talks about this on page 29 and 30 of the article. He says history also tells people who they are. It tells people where they come from. It tells people what their potential is as a people. And if it doesn't do that, if history does not tell you who you are, where you come from, and what your potential is, then it is useful. So history is a usable, useful thing. And if it's not useful to you, if it doesn't empower you, it's useless. I think this is also why people tend to be bored in history classes. I used to be. And then he goes on to talk about how a name is similar to history. It's got to do some things. A name can't just be any old thing. A name has to provide people with an understanding of their history by connecting them to, one, a landmass, a language, a culture, a religion, or a philosophy. And then he asked the question, does colored refer us back to or provide us with a connection to a landmass, a language, a culture, a religion? No. Does the term Negro provide us with a landmass, a language, a culture, a religion? Does the word black even do that? Where's Negro land? Is that a landmass? Is that a place that we can go to, Negro land? Is there a place where Negro exists? And on the other side of that, to kind of juxtapose these two phenomena, he talks about Europeans and how they actually do that with naming. They transport their culture, their landmass, their language, their religion and philosophy. They transport that stuff across the ocean when they come over here to America. This is why there is a region of this country called New England, because there's an old England. And they said, we want a New England. We're going to reproduce home for ourselves here. And that matters. That gives us something to hold on to, a culture, a language, a religion, and a landmass to refer back to. That's old England. It's right there. I know there's a place that my ancestors are from. And so my history doesn't just start here. It's older than that. It matters. It has value, right? Even dogs get to keep their origin, like German shepherds and, French poodles and things like that. So really, African people tend to be the only folks who haven't had that, again, up until recently. And this is the argument behind using African American. So he also then starts to really walk us down this history path. He talks about the origins of the word Negro. Um, there's more I could say about that. And a good friend of mine who studies Old Latin, not regular Latin, not newfangled Latin, Old Latin, and he says negro or negro. It is in a modern context referring to the color black, but in Old Latin, negro is also of the same root as necro, which means dead, and it also means soulless. And so at this time, and kind of referring back to your reading, he talks about Pope Nicholas V and how in 1452, before Columbus and them, he issues a decree where he basically allows European nations to go into Africa and take people out, these so-called heathens, these infidels, these enemies of Christ, who are pagans. They're not good Catholics. They don't practice Christianity, and so they are outside of God's grace. You have my permission, me the Pope, all you kings have permission to go into Africa and take out whoever you want, because the rules of Christian conduct don't apply to these people. They are Negroes. They are necros. They have, at this point, the Pope begins down this journey of Europe trying to convince itself that Africa was never its teacher. We're going to erase that history. Africa, in fact, is a land full of soulless people, soulless beings that are less than people. If they can convince themselves that Africans don't have souls, then they don't have to worry about treating us harshly, brutally, and devaluing our lives. This is where the sentiment and the spirit of the times comes from. And as I said, history is a loop. And so how do we see this idea of the devaluing of black life and writing us off as somehow outside of the human family and outside of the grace of God? How does that inform how we are treated by Europeans? It begins with Pope Nick. And also he talks about the ways in which religion, specifically the Catholic religion, directly facilitated the slave trade. The Pope gave Spain and Portugal permission to enslave Africans. This is very important. This is why the Catholic Church is still the wealthiest religious entity on the planet. They own more real estate than I think almost any other entity on the planet. This is slavery money. This is the legacy of this decision making. And myth making and stereotyping. So this is when Africans go from being teachers to being inferior in every way. Page 32 through 34, like they just clips from different pieces of writing, different texts that were very popular and circulating throughout Europe that circulated ideas. It was like a big media frenzy where they basically spent a lot of time and energy writing about how inferior Africans was because they needed to convince Europe that this was okay what they were doing to Africans because Africans deserved it. All the harsh treatment, all the brutality and violence because we were not worthy human beings. He also talks about the causes of chattel slavery. Why does chattel slavery happen? Why is it so important for Europe? First, Europe's addiction to sugar and spice and everything nice. This is why now we have this running joke about, someone having bad British teeth and things like that. That, if you watch like British television or sitcoms, they talk about, I have bad British teeth. They tend to like be unhealthy, their oral situations. But that's because of a sugar addiction that happened hundreds of years ago. And also to correspond with that, the lack of proper oral hygiene. Eventually Africans had to come in and teach them a little bit about that as well. But Africans on the flip side did have really awesome culture, oral hygiene, and my dad still used chewing sticks, but people now are figuring out that the sap and the juice from the essence of the wood from these trees actually does, do something for the health of one's gums and teeth. And now you can buy chewing sticks in freaking Whole Foods. But I digress. Another reason for chattel slavery or justification was that once the Europeans came to the quote-unquote New World, to the Americas, and began to wipe out the native population here and take over land, they needed somebody to work the land. At first, they tried to enslave the Native Americans. That didn't work out. And so they decided to try to fill the labor void with Africans. More on that later. They needed to build up Europe's economy. They talk about why in some of the quotes in your article. And everyday people, everyday Europeans got rich off this whole slave trade idea. A lot of people are like, oh, well, my ancestors didn't have slaves. They stayed over in Europe, or I'm from Italy. We didn't do that. Da, 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 da. Yeah, but everybody in Europe was getting paid off slavery one way or another. Think about it. Slavery is an economy. Someone had to build the ships. Someone had to make the shackles. Someone had to make bricks that were used to build fortresses and jails and holding cells. Like, even, and he says even the little old lady in, in Europe, was able to, like, make a lot of money on her investment, up to 4,000% profit just from putting her little savings up in the slave trade and just investing in it. People just made money left. William Shakespeare, he didn't make his money from writing plays. He made his money from investing in slavery. And so this is how Europe becomes, fashion capitals of the world, and Paris and Milan. Where do these big cities come from, these metropoles? They come from slavery money. This is what builds Europe into the developed set of nations that we see today. But at the same time, what does this require? This requires the historical erasure, the erasing of Africa's greatness. It also requires the historical aggrandizement of Europeans, making them, again, that historical logic of whiteness, making them the best, the most important, the beginners of everything. And then, on page 37, Winston Churchill really talks about how history is going to look favorably upon, the British, because he's going to write the history. So, of course, it's going to be in favor of them. And this is, overall, you can talk about how this leads to the colonization of knowledge itself. Europeans begin to colonize knowledge. What does that mean? They begin to define everything, or redefine everything. Everybody in the world's got their own way of looking at things, and then all of a sudden Europeans come along, they make a little money, and they decide that everybody else's way of doing things is wrong, and they tell them and they enforce it. They're like, your way of looking at the map and the world and geography is wrong. We're going to create our map. So that's where the Mercator map comes from, and we still use that map, even though that map was important in the 16th century. Like, talk about outdated. Now, a response to that could be the Peters projection map. I'm also going to post a map called Africa Uncolonized, which is pretty cool. What it might have looked like had the Europeans not come and taken turf and people. But even the map is distorted to make Europe the center of the world and make it bigger than it actually is in real life, so that you are psychologically programmed to see Europe as the most important place and group of people on the planet. The colonization of knowledge includes the colonizing of time, how time and the calendar and everything else is organized. The colonization of belief systems. People must be Catholic. If they are not Catholic, then they are regarded as non-entities. People must be Christian. People must believe what Europeans believe, and all native or indigenous belief systems are demonized and cast off as backwards or demonic or a problem in general. Because if you look at God the way Europeans look at God, then they themselves become God. They can make God look like them and convince you that you are to be their slave and give them what they want to take, because, in essence, God is requesting it. God is demanding it. And this is really a central issue. The three G's, gold, glory, and God, that they come out there seeking, Christopher Columbus and them, really is truly related to this idea of colonizing knowledge, colonizing economies and the way people have and distribute resources in their societies. They change all of that. They introduce money. And to people who didn't have that before, they introduce weapons. To people who didn't have a need for weapons like that before, they introduce a certain level of violence that many parts of the world had never seen and were not really prepared for or interested in. They introduced new concepts of gender and family organization that other people hadn't seen. And so, European culture is a patriarchal culture. Other cultures were not typically that way, but they begin to change. So now even what we think of as traditional culture in a lot of places is not really what was there before. It is influenced by Europe. And then finally he ends with Pope John Paul II in 1992, 500 years after the 1492 voyage of Christopher Columbus. Pope John Paul II learned some things about slavery and all of this, what he's talking about. And he apologizes. He asks for the forgiveness of African people. which is really, really interesting, you know. But what I'm urging you to do is understand that it is possible to forgive, but it is never wise to forget. That's what we're here for. Have a good week.